Hi guys, welcome back to Chess the Matthew. So on this video, we'll tackle about what is the fork in chess. So the fork in chess is a piece that actually attacks the enemy pieces simultaneously. In which, for example, the defender here cannot defend both pieces that was actually forked, and it is actually effective when there is a fork, for example, with a check. For example, a knight that actually give a check and also attacks another pieces on the board. So here on this game, I will show you the example about the fork on chess. So let's start, for example, after knight f3, controlling the center, knight f6, doing the same, and for example, after g3, d5, and after, for example, bishop g2, bishop f5, developing his bishop on the f5 square, before, for example, putting this pawn on this e6, and after, for example, castling e6, and here the white plays the move d3, controlling the center and also vacating the square, for example, for the knight, or even to open up this diagonal on the board. And for example, after e6 and knight b to d2, in which, for example, the black here plays knight a6, aiming for c5 and trying to delay some development of this bishop, for example. And also this knight can also hop on the square. And for example, after a3, stopping that idea. And after knight c5, c4, putting some tension on the center. And for example, after b5, we shall see in this position now, in which on this move, a black allows here for the white here to play knight b4, that was actually having a fork on the pawns on c6, for example, and b5, and again against this bishop f5. For example, in this position, this pawn was actually undefended, and still this pawn has two attackers versus one defender. So for example, after the black here defend the pawn on c6 and b5, the white here grab the bishop on f5, and for example, after it takes f5, in which the white here wins the double bishop on the board. And after, for example, after knight b3, h6, bishop e3, again putting some two attackers to this c5 knight against this only one defender, the bishop f8. And for example, after knight e6, escaping to the attack. And again, after knight d4, in which the white here again have a fork on the board, in which it attacks four pieces. For example, after this attack on the f5, e6, c6 and b5, for example, on this position. And here, black here just defend his f5, in which it is actually the only piece that actually undefended. And after g6, it was now defended because this pieces was actually defended by this queen. And after, for example, queen b3, pressurizing the b5, for example, on this position with three attackers with only one defender. And the black here defend the b5, for example, after rook b8. But again, on this position, it allows the white here to conduct a fork, for example, after knight takes c6. Because after queen takes c6, again, there is a pawn fork on the board with c takes d5 that forks the queen and the knight. And again, this pawn was actually supported by two pieces with two attackers and two defender. And we all know that any aggressive move against this pawn will lead to the compromise of the pieces of the aggressive one, because there is two attackers and two defender on the board. And for example, after knight c5, countering an attack against the white queen. But for example, after queen c3, again there is a queen fork on the board because it attacks both the knights on the board. For example, this knight has two attackers versus two defender. So if this queen will leave a defense against this knight, then this knight will drop on the board, because this queen should be moved because there was an attack with d5. And for example, after queen to d6, escaping to the attack of the pawn, but there's just simple bishop takes c5. And after queen takes c5, again there is queen takes f6 with an attack to the rook on h8. And for example, after escape to the attack of the queen of the black rook to g8, but again there is another fork on the board with queen to e5, forking the king and the rook on its position. So the defender here was obliged to defend first the check before saving his rook, as a rule that if there is check, the defender here should react first against the check. And for example, after queen to e7, covering the check, but still there's the simple queen takes b8 check. Again, there is a fork on its position against the black king and the pawn. And in the same manner, after, for example, queen to d8, covering the check, but there is just simple queen takes b5 with a check. And again, with plus 3 pawns and an extra rook on the board. So we shall see on this position now that the white here is actually winning by using the fork technique on chess. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget to subscribe.